Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. Let me tweet this out because apparently people have not been getting notifications. I don't know if that's a proxy for, or that's part and parcel to being demonetized. But let's just say going live. I hope everyone is doing okay this morning. I have a few more videos that I'm going to do today, even though I'm going to take a lunch break after this one. I think this is going to be my schedule, guys. Essentially doing them essentially through the course of the day. If something takes place at night, let's say like some big news event or something, at that point I'd intervene, but I think I'm probably going to try to keep them during the day. But I got to be honest, knowing me, my schedule is horrific from the standpoint of sleep, so I may also still be doing them at night. It's just a notification so everyone will have it. Good. Let me check my volume. I hope everyone is doing okay. By the way, this little nod, you can click the link at the bottom. Because the channel is demonetized, you can't necessarily give super chat in a typical way. However, you can still give donations for the channel. You can do that by clicking the little donation button at the bottom. It would take you to a PayPal alternative that would allow you to give a donation. Any donation that you give, I'll still read out your donation, and there will be a little icon that jumps up. That's a Star Trek icon. Spock, Scotty, and somebody else, but there are different ones depending on the amounts that are given. So now that that's out the way, let's do the news. I had the pleasure, the honor, to work with Elizabeth Voss and some of the others in the visual that they had for Julian Assange on Saturday. My spot was at 5 o'clock, and something took place where it shut the entire thing down towards the end of it. But I was honored to be asked and invited into the visual. Julian Assange has been at that embassy for 6 years. Barely any sunlight, if at all. Caged, for all intents and purposes, for releasing untouched, unmolested information. Information that has always been found to be factual and true. And in many cases have shown governments committing illegal or repugnant behavior. Listen to this. This is a defender of free speech. Right here. You can read it with me. It's not a long piece, it's a short piece. I stress this point because there's a current relevance to the case of Julian Assange. This is essentially a defense of Assange. To the relevance of Julian Assange, who will remember our Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, described as someone who has broken the law by publishing the contents of confidential U.S. State Department cables. Not only was it perfectly obvious that Julian Assange had broken no Australian law, and despite the strenuous efforts of the American authorities, there is no evidence to date that he has broken any American ones. But the decision of the High Court in Spycatcher makes it quite clear that any action in an Australian court to restrain Assange from publishing the state document cables would have failed. Listen to what he's saying. He's making an argument by Australian law. Assange, Australian citizen. Assange has broken no law by Australian standards, nor has Assange broken a law by American standards. These remarks by Prime Minister, which were echoed by her Attorney General, were particularly regrettable, not simply because she was so obviously in error from a legal point of view, but whatever one may think of Assange, he is an Australian citizen. More importantly, perhaps, at the time he was being described as breaking the law by Mrs. Gillard, prominent American politicians and journalists were describing him as a terrorist and in some cases calling for him to be assassinated. Sarah Palin, possibly the next U.S. president, God forbid, called for him to be pursued with the same urgency we would pursue Al-Qaeda and the Taliban leaders. No doubt her supporters were able to read what they liked into that remark, meaning droning. We have killers. We go around the world murdering people with drones, flying killer robots, and essentially mercenaries. What she was trying to get at was clear. While Assange is no doubt quite safe from assassination, when an Australian citizen is threatened in this way, the Australian Prime Minister should respond. Julian Gillard could have quite properly deplored her publishing of confidential information, sympathized with our embarrassed American allies, but at the same token, registering our profound unhappiness that the Australian citizen is being threatened in this way by leading figures in another country whose commitment to quote-unquote freedom of speech and rule of law we traditionally regard as being no less than our own. She might even have taken time to ask how on earth the United States security arrangements were so slack that hundreds of thousands of highly confidential documents could be copied into a disk by the 23-year-old Army Private Bradley Manning. Who said that? Who's giving this incorruptible defense of Julian Assange? This correct and straightforward, right defense of Julian Assange. Clearly, it's from the perspective of an Australian citizen who's proud that he's an Australian citizen and was was bothered by America essentially talking about assassinating an Australian citizen for doing something that doesn't break Australian law nor does it break American law. Who could this possibly be? This person is Malcolm Turnbull. Malcolm Turnbull, I should have had a picture of him up. Damn, I should have had a picture of him up. That's my bad, I'm sorry. This guy. This guy that looks constipated in this picture. That's the Prime Minister of Australia. The same guy that wrote this document. That's the Prime Minister of Australia. Listen to this. The strident defense. I stress this point because the current relevance in the case of Julian Assange, who you remember our Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, described as someone who has broken the law by publishing the contents of confidential U.S. State Department cables. Not only was it perfectly obvious that Julian Assange had broken the Australian law, despite the strenuous efforts by the American authorities, there is no evidence to date that he broke any American law. This is the current Prime Minister of Australia giving a defense of Julian Assange. Right, and let's keep going. These remarks by the Prime Minister, which were echoed by Attorney General, were particularly regrettable, not simply because she was so obviously in error from a legal point of view, but whatever one may think of Assange, he is an Australian citizen. This is said by the current Australian Prime Minister. Well, if I heard this, if I read this document, and the document is at the bottom, you can read the entirety of the document yourself. If I read this document, I would think in error that this guy is sympathetic to the plight of Julian Assange. He's taken the Prime Minister to task for not standing up for an Australian citizen. But I will be in error. This is political gamesmanship, of course. He's saying this when he's not the Prime Minister. And now that he is the Prime Minister, all of a sudden he's gone mum. All of a sudden he has nothing to say. Malcolm Turnbull has let down the people who put him in that office, who thought that he would be sympathetic to Assange. They weren't wrong for thinking he would be sympathetic to Assange. I mean, after all, he did write that document. All of those words that I just recounted to you were words that he said. But like politicians in the United States who say what they need to say to get in office, and the moment they get in office, hey, Obama, what about the public option? But you said public option when you were on the campaign trail. Why did it all of a sudden vanish the moment that you got in office? This is Turnbull's public option. You can say all of the stuff about protecting free speech and Julian Assange being essentially a journalist, and a journalist publishing factually true information. The moment you get in that office and you have the opportunity to make a decision on this front, you go mum, you go mute. You have all of these words to say when you're not in power, and the moment that you get in power, silence. Crickets. Absolute crickets. What a hypocrite. You should be ashamed of yourself. Why even have these words? And by the way, he deleted this. Once he got in office and the pressure started to mount, hey, maybe this guy is sympathetic. I mean, after all, we believe this guy is sympathetic because that guy said all of these words backing free speech and backing this idea that Julian Assange is a journalist. And more than that, he's an Australian citizen. And as Australian citizen, we're going to back our citizen. Not so much. Let's look at this article. This article is awesome. But one of the things to keep in mind, he deleted that. He deleted that. On Twitter, people were giving him the business on it. It is unacceptable in our democratic society that there should be a restraint on publication of information related to the government when only the vice of the information that it enables the public to discuss, review, and criticize government action. That was Malcolm Turnbull, the same guy who has lost his tongue, who's mute, who hasn't said squat. He was taken to task over this on Twitter years ago, but he hasn't said anything since. This was all the way back in April 2013. WikiLeaks, why don't you spare us your sanctimony? I spoke about Assange years ago and haven't changed my views. That was 5 years ago. That was 5 years ago. If he hasn't changed his views and he was perfectly okay with giving the business to the last prime minister for not standing up to the Australian citizen, what now? What now? They are planning on locking him up. The United States is going to be standing there with an extradition warrant the moment that they eject Assange from that place. An Australian citizen. An Australian citizen. All of these flowery words about protection of Australian citizens and freedom of speech. All of these flowery language until he took office. And he deleted that speech. Or that blog, I should say. What a coward. What a hypocrite. What an absolute, complete hypocrite. Let's look at this story. Julian Assange's core supporters initially hoped that Malcolm Turnbull would push the United States to end its pursuit of WikiLeaks chief, according to private correspondence leaked to the media. They based their expectations on the Australian Prime Minister's previous history of supporting free speech and comments he'd made about Assange before becoming Prime Minister. But Assange himself was dubious that Turnbull deposing Abbott as Prime Minister in 2015 would aid his cause. WikiLeaks advisors have noted a softening of Australia's government stance towards Assange in recent months, and Turnbull is believed to have recently received a personal letter from Assange's father pleading on humanitarian grounds. Diplomatic representatives from the Australian High Commission visited Assange for a private discussion in June, the first such visit since he's entered the embassy, though he was previously contacted by Australian officials by phone and offered consular assistance. In September 2015, when Turnbull replaced Abbott, the chat group fired up Assange supporters did their homework on the Prime Minister. They seized on a speech he gave to Sydney University Law School in March 2011, which had featured on Turnbull's personal blog, but was later deleted. And right there, if he was going to stand by it, he would have left it there. The fact that he deleted told everything that was going to take place. Turnbull was going to turn tail. And in this case, he was saying what he had to say from the standpoint of free speech because it sounded good, but the moment that he was in a position of authority to do something about it, Turnbull turned tail and went the other way. These people were hopeful that he was going to do something about it. Ultimately, this article is his supporters were hopeful that Turnbull, that the Prime Minister was going to do something because the Prime Minister seemed to have a stance that was favorable to Julian Assange as a journalist. We've heard nothing from the Prime Minister at this point. And for somebody who is sympathetic, we've heard nothing. He's been silent. The thing that he chastised his opponent for, the moment that he gets into office, he does the exact same thing. Julian Assange is left hanging in that embassy. In a real way, you can compare this to something like a person who's on death row, where they keep taking him in and taking him out, where he gets stays of executions, where he has no idea what is going to take place from the standpoint of his person. He's not an American citizen. He's broken no American laws. The Swedish government has dropped the case that was involved with the British government. Look, most likely there is an extradition order where you have the vassal state, that is Britain, willing to turn him over to the United States if he steps out of that embassy. That's the crux of this. Now, if Turnbull believed in this idea of Australian citizenship, and that the Australian Prime Minister should have intervened in order to back up the Australian citizen that's left hanging in the embassy, time to stand up. Time to stand up. Turnbull, in this case, has been a flamboyant disappointment. And he continues to be a flamboyant disappointment. And we have yet to hear anything from Australia, meaning the Australian position on what is taking place. Years ago, he said his position hasn't changed. Well, if he's standing there with a position that hasn't changed, he damn sure hasn't done anything to get across the position of the Australian government. Or maybe you can make the point of saying the silence of Turnbull gets across the position of the Australian government more than anything that they could say. I'm not going to keep this one long. I didn't know that Turnbull was such a coward on this front. I knew that all of these states were vassal states of America. I got that part. But I didn't realize that you come out and you say something verbally, vocally. This is what I believe in. This is what I represent. I am a free speech prime minister. And that other prime minister, that sniveling coward of a prime minister, if it was me, if I was in that seat, I would have represented, I would have stood up for Julian Assange, because he's an Australian citizen after all. And I'm goddamn Malcolm Turnbull. And 2015, Malcolm Turnbull takes that seat, and Malcolm Turnbull shuts the fuck up. And Assange flails in the wind. An Australian citizen that doesn't have a country that will back him up in the least. It's amazing. You should be ashamed of yourself. Shame on you. Shame on you. That's why you're constipated in that picture. Shame on you. Shame on you, Malcolm Turnbull. I'm not going to keep this one long. Let me see. I do want to thank whoever just gave that donation. Stephen Carl, let's set up a time to chat off camera before we chat on camera. Okay, that was random. Let's set up a time to chat off camera before we chat on camera. I think it's because of something that we were talking about. But yeah, that's fine. Send me an email, Stephen. Send me an email. All right, guys, I'm going to end this here. 18 minutes. It's a little long. It's not too long. I don't necessarily want to continuously drone on. I am greatly concerned about the status of Julian Assange. And if a politician had a point of view when they took office, I may dislike the point of view, but at the very least, I realize, okay, this was their point of view before. This is their point of view after. Nothing has changed on the ground. The world is good. I mean, I like the point of view, but fair enough. It's another thing when they have an espoused point of view and they get into office and they do something different. I have a certain, there's a special place in hell for people who do that, because you give people a certain idea of who you are, and then you get into office and they realize that you're somebody else, and what you gave them as an idea was purely there to scam votes from those people. So yeah, coward, hypocrite, Malcolm Turnbull was for Julian Assange until he got into office, in which case he became like every other hack vassal state politician that gets elected into these European countries. I'll leave it at this. If you enjoyed the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe, and of course, you can always support the Patreon. Thanks, guys. And Stephen Carl, thank you, my man. I appreciate it.